Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something many of you might be wondering about. How exactly do you build a really successful podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question.
We had a listener ask specifically about making a show like Chapter Crunch, the one that does those great summaries of popular books.
Right. Engaging stuff.
Now, we don't have the secret Chapter Crunch playbook, unfortunately, but we do have something else, something that maybe surprisingly offers some really relevant insights. It's a guide called Beat Anxiety, 10 Simple Techniques.
Okay, I know that sounds like a bit of a leap, maybe. But think about it for a second. A great podcast and, well, managing something like anxiety, they actually rely on similar core ideas.
How so?
Well, it's about clear communication that connects, content that really holds your attention, and crucially, insights that you, the listener or reader, can actually use. The way a guide helps you tackle a personal challenge often uses the same building blocks that keep you hooked on a podcast.
That makes a lot of sense. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to pull apart this Beat Anxiety guide. We want to extract strategies you can use for building a compelling podcast. And we're focusing on those 4 key things our listener mentioned for a show like Chapter Crunch: captivating summaries, practical insights, interactivity, and a dynamic structure.
Got it.
Okay, let's dive in. First step, those captivating summaries.
Right. What's really interesting in the anxiety guide is how it starts. It's very direct. It defines the topic anxiety right away and states its purpose. Here's a 10-step plan to understand and manage it.
Okay, so for a podcast doing summaries,
It really highlights how vital that clear intro is. You need to tell your listeners immediately, okay, this is the book we're covering, and here's specifically what you're going to get out of listening to this breakdown. No ambiguity.
yeah, setting the stage. And the guide itself, it takes this big, potentially scary topic, anxiety, and chops it into 10 distinct chapters. Each one tackles a specific piece.
Exactly. It's not just one huge info dump. It's segmented. Much easier to process.
And that's a lesson for podcasting right there.
Absolutely. The book covers, understanding triggers, challenging thoughts, finding coping methods all in separate chunks. A podcast like Chapter Crunch probably works well because it does the same thing, right?
But
Breaks down a book's big ideas into focused segments so you don't get overwhelmed.
and the language in Beat Anxiety, it's very, very straightforward. It steers clear of heavy psychological terms. It talks directly to someone who's maybe struggling and needs clear help.
That's so important. A key takeaway. If your podcast aims to inform quickly, maybe reach a broad audience, that clarity, that concise language, it's everything. You want people to get it without needing a PhD.
Definitely. Now, here's something I found really effective in the guide. Lots of chapters kick off with a direct question. Like chapter 1 just asks, so what exactly is anxiety?
Yeah.
It just pulls you right in, sets the expectation for what's coming.
That's a fantastic technique for podcasts, too. Imagine starting a segment on, a business book with what really separates a manager from a leader.
Right. It sparks curiosity. It makes you lean in and listen for the answer in the summary. And it's not just the start. Each chapter in the guide wraps up with concluding thoughts, and often it gives a little hint about the next chapter.
Yeah, that provides closure on the current point, but also builds a little anticipation.
Keeps the momentum going.
For sure. So for podcast segments, maybe do a quick recap of the key points you just covered, then drop a little teaser for what's next. It creates this nice flow, makes the listener want to stick around for the whole journey.
Okay, so we've seen how the structure of this guide offers clues for crafting those captivating summaries. Clarity, segmentation, engaging questions, good transitions. Makes sense. Now let's move to the practical insights. This guide is packed with them.
Oh, absolutely. What really stands out are the actual tools in the book. Like there's a trigger log template early on, and worksheets for tackling negative thoughts, even one for organizing your physical space.
Yeah, concrete stuff.
It's not just abstract advice. These are things the reader can literally pick up and use right away.
And it goes deeper than just templates. It details specific techniques like diaphragmatic breathing or the 4-7-8 breathing exercise, step-by-step instructions you can try immediately.
That 1-minute rule for tidying up is another great example. It's small, doable, practical, a tiny action with potentially big results.
Totally. I also noticed how many chapters end with lists of apps, online resources for mental wellness, physical health, finding therapists.
Yeah, that's providing direct value beyond the main text. It's saying, here's where you can go next.
So how does this translate to a podcast like Chapter Crunch?
Well, it means you can't just summarize the book's ideas. You need to give listeners actionable takeaways. How can they apply these
Okay,
lessons?
like what?
It could be suggesting specific exercises based on the book, maybe posing reflection questions for them to think about later, or recommending other resources, just like the guide does. If the book's about setting goals, the podcast could challenge listeners. Okay, using this framework, what's one small goal you can set this week?
Gotcha. Making it relevant to their lives.
And another thing the Anxiety Guide does well is encourage personalization. It suggests tailoring coping strategies or therapy techniques to fit your specific needs.
Right. It's not one size fits all.
Exactly. And a podcast should probably do that too. Encourage listeners to think critically, how does this idea apply to my situation? Empower them to adapt the info, not just passively receive it.
Okay, good points. Let's talk interactivity. Now, obviously, a book isn't interactive in the way a podcast can be.
True, it's a more solitary thing. But we can still draw inspiration from how the guide promotes engagement. It has these self-reflection prompts sprinkled throughout. It asks the reader to pause and think about their own experiences.
Ah, okay. So for a podcast, that could mean asking direct questions to the listener. Maybe even suggesting a brief pause for them to actually think about it.
Could be, yeah. And unlike a book, a podcast can react. You could build future discussions around listener feedback or questions about books you've already covered. Makes it feel more alive, more responsive.
That trigger log template you mentioned, while you can't fill it out during the podcast,
Right.
the idea behind it is interesting. Could listeners be encouraged to track how a book's themes show up in their own lives?
That's a great question. How do you encourage that active participation? Maybe suggest they keep a mental log during the week? Note when concepts from the book pop up? Perhaps even invite anonymized reflections for future discussion.
Yeah, could work. And the way the guide's chapters build on each other. Maybe that inspires future deep dives. If listeners are really interested in one specific part of a summarized book, you could revisit it in more detail later.
Definitely. That creates a nice feedback loop.
Mhm.
Makes the audience feel more involved, like it's a collaboration.
All right, last element. Structura dynamica, dynamic structure. Looking back at Beat Anxiety, it has a pretty clear, effective flow.
It really does. It starts with that sharp, engaging introduction, sets the scene, promises value. Just like a podcast needs a strong opening hook. What's this about? Why should you care?
Then you get those clearly defined chapters, each focused on one piece of the puzzle, like focused segments in a chapter crunch episode, right? Each tackling a key idea.
hmm And inside each chapter, you get the explanations, some examples, and those crucial practical techniques, the practical tips we talked about.
Now, the guide doesn't explicitly pull out iconic quotes into their own section.
No, but as we said, those memorable phrases or powerful statements are definitely woven into the text.
So for a podcast summary, pulling out and highlighting a few really impactful quotes could be a good strategy. Make things stickier.
Absolutely. It makes the key messages more resonant, more memorable, long after you've finished listening.
And we already touched on how each chapter ends with concluding thoughts and often leads into the next topic, a mini conclusion and a bridge.
So yeah, translating that to a dynamic podcast structure, maybe start each chapter or segment with a quick overview of the theme. Then go deeper into the insights and applications. Highlight a key quote or example. Summarize that bit concisely, then smoothly transition to the next idea.
And layered over all of that is the tone, right? Our conversational, hopefully enthusiastic delivery. That's key to keeping it engaging, stopping it from sounding like a textbook reading.
Totally agree. The energy and clarity from the hosts themselves make a huge difference in how accessible and, frankly, enjoyable the information feels.
Okay, so let's try and recap this deep dive. We looked at beat anxiety to find clues for building a podcast like Chapter Crunch. What are the main takeaways?
Well, first, a clear, logical structure is essential, breaking things down step by step like the guide does.
Second, creating engaging summaries, making complex stuff digestible, segmenting it well.
Third, offering those practical, actionable insights, giving listeners tools they can actually use, just like the guide provides worksheets and techniques.
Fourth, finding ways to encourage interactivity, moving beyond just passive listening, maybe inspired by things like self-reflection prompts.
And finally, wrapping it all in a dynamic structure. Good intro, focused segments with practical bits and memorable moments, and clear conclusions or transitions.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it? How strategies for helping someone manage their inner world translate so directly to communicating information effectively.
It really speaks to the power of clear, empathetic, well-organized communication, doesn't it? If you can successfully guide someone through the complexities inside their own head, you probably have the skills to guide them through new information in a way that's helpful and engaging.
So, for all of you thinking about starting a podcast, it's especially one that involves summarizing complex information, these principles seem really solid. Think about clarity and structure, real world value, audience engagement, and that dynamic listening experience.
Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with. How can we take that structured, supportive feel, the kind you find in resources for personal challenges, like this anxiety guide, and apply it more broadly to how we share and learn information through podcasts? It's about creating a learning experience that feels less like a lecture and more like a guided journey, one that leaves you feeling, well, more knowledgeable and capable.